Maddox Williams had to fight for his life before he was even supposed to be born. He arrived approximately 11 weeks early, weighing less than 3 pounds. And while doctors worked to keep his tiny body warm, breathing, and stable, the adults waiting outside the NICU were already dealing with addiction, trauma, and a family history defined by instability. That contrast matters, because when you look at photographs of Maddox, none of that chaos is visible. You see an affectionate little boy with a bright smile. His family would later remember him as caring, funny, energetic, and beautiful. A child who grew stronger than anyone might have expected after such a fragile beginning. But the world he was born into was already pulling in several directions at once. Maddox was born on January 9th, 2018, in Maine, to Jessica Johnson and Andrew Williams. By then, both parents had histories of drug addiction, and their relationship had been described as volatile, almost from the beginning. Jessica had grown up in Stockton Springs. By her teenage years and into her early 20s, she had become addicted to different drugs. During that period, she met Jessica Trefethen. They began a relationship and eventually had 3 children together. The relationship did not last, but Jason would remain part of Jessica's life. After their separation, Jessica met Andrew Williams. Andrew came into that relationship carrying trauma of his own. When he was 18 years old, he witnessed his father die by suicide from a gunshot wound. Andrew was reportedly diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and he continued to struggle with serious mental health issues. He also developed an addiction. Before meeting Jessica, Andrew had a daughter from an earlier relationship. That relationship ended, and eventually he and Jessica became involved. Their life together was turbulent, but they married. By 2017, Jessica was pregnant with their first child together. That child was Maddox. He was expected to arrive in late March 2018. Instead, complications began in December. Jessica went to the hospital, where doctors reportedly warned that she needed to remain on bed rest or risk giving birth prematurely. According to the account later given, she did not remain in the hospital. Then, on January 9th, Maddox was born, 11 weeks early, less than 3 pounds. He was immediately placed inside an incubator, where the temperature could be carefully controlled because a premature baby that small may not be able to keep himself warm. Monitoring pads were attached to his chest so the medical team could continuously track his heart rate and oxygen levels. At that stage, every number mattered, every breath mattered, and Maddox kept breathing. He spent the next 2 months in neonatal intensive care. Think about how long that is for a newborn. For weeks, his entire world was an incubator. Medical equipment, alarms, nurses, and the hands reaching through small openings to care for him. Before he had ever slept in a crib at home, he had already survived the kind of medical crisis that can overwhelm a full-grown adult. By the time Maddox was finally strong enough to leave the NICU, Jessica and Andrew had separated. Jessica had returned to Jessica Trefethen and was living with him and their 3 children in a small trailer in Stockton Springs. She also stopped using the surname Williams and went back to Trefethen. So that was the home Maddox entered after 2 months of intensive medical care. The decision to allow him to live there would later draw scrutiny, because Maine's Department of Health and Human Services and its Child Welfare Division had already been involved with Jessica and her older children on multiple occasions. Jessica was known to have struggled with addiction. She had been prescribed methadone, a medication commonly used to treat opioid dependence by reducing withdrawal symptoms and cravings. That does not mean methadone itself was the problem. When it is properly taken and safely stored, it is a legitimate treatment, but it can be extremely dangerous to a small child. And only weeks after Maddox came home, that danger became real. At 2:55 in the afternoon on March 22nd, 2018, the Waldo County Sheriff's Office received a call reporting that a child had overdosed inside the trailer. Deputies rushed to the home and found Jason panicking as he tried to help his 2-year-old son. The child had swallowed liquid methadone. Both Jessica and Jason had prescriptions for the medication, although Jason did not identify whose bottle the boy had accessed. He said his son had somehow grabbed it and consumed an unknown amount. For a 2-year-old, even that uncertainty is terrifying. No one knew how much he had swallowed, how quickly it might suppress his breathing, or whether emergency treatment would work in time. Paramedics began caring for him. The little boy was given Narcan, a medication that can rapidly reverse the effects of an opioid overdose, and he was taken by ambulance to the hospital. Thankfully, he survived. He received treatment and made a full recovery. But the overdose exposed exactly how unsafe the home had become. A toddler had been able to reach a bottle of methadone and drink from it. Meanwhile, 2.5-month-old Maddox had only just left intensive care after fighting to survive his premature birth. Law enforcement notified child welfare officials. The children were removed from the trailer, including Maddox. This time, the call went to Andrew. He was told what had happened and came to collect his son. Maddox went to live with Andrew, Andrew's older daughter, and his paternal grandmother, Victoria Vose. And this is where Maddox's story briefly begins to look different. Victoria adored her grandchildren. Under her roof, Maddox had people watching over him while Andrew tried to manage his own addiction and mental health struggles and raise 2 children as a single father. It was not a perfect situation. Andrew was still dealing with serious problems. But Maddox was no longer the medically fragile newborn who had arrived from the NICU. Over the next 2 years, he gained weight. He grew stronger. He became healthy, happy, and energetic. The affectionate little boy his family remembers. Jessica was permitted supervised visits during that period, but according to the account given by Maddox's family, she saw him only once in those 2 years. There were additional custody hearings, and Maddox continued living with Andrew. As long as Andrew and the children remained under Victoria's roof, the arrangement appeared to hold. The methadone overdose had removed Maddox from one unstable home. For the first time in his short life, it seemed as though he might finally have something solid beneath him. And honestly, when you know what came later, that may be the hardest part. There were people who loved him. There was a home where he had grown stronger. For a while, this looked like the rescue Maddox needed. Then Andrew carried his toddler into a burglary. Andrew appears to have loved Maddox, but love did not stop him from making decisions that repeatedly placed his son in danger. For roughly 2 years, Maddox lived with Andrew, his older half-sister, and his paternal grandmother, Victoria Vose. Under Victoria's roof, the little boy who had entered the world weighing less than 3 pounds began to thrive. She doted on both grandchildren. Maddox gained weight, grew stronger, and became a healthy, happy, energetic toddler. For a while, that home gave him something his earliest months had lacked: stability. But even there, the situation was more complicated than it looked. Victoria was also watching her son struggle with the same demons that had followed him for years. Andrew had severe emotional trauma and a history of addiction. Now he was trying to manage those problems while raising 2 young children as a single father. By the accounts given later, he cared deeply about Maddox. He wanted to be his father. He wanted to keep him. The problem was that wanting those things and being able to provide them were not always the same. During this period, Jessica was permitted supervised contact with Maddox. Yet, according to the family's account, she visited him only once in those 2 years. There were additional custody hearings, and each time, Maddox remained with Andrew. From the outside, it may have seemed that the arrangement was holding together. And under Victoria's roof, maybe it was. Things changed after Andrew moved out and got a place of his own. On January 28, 2020, a man inside a nearby apartment heard a child crying downstairs. That alone was strange. He lived by himself. There should not have been a child in his home. When he went down to investigate, he found Andrew holding Maddox in one arm and a speaker in the other. The speaker belonged to the homeowner. Police were called, and officers reportedly discovered that other property had also been taken. Some of it had been placed inside Maddox's stroller, which was parked outside. Think about that for a second. A stroller, the thing meant to carry and protect a toddler, was allegedly being used to carry stolen property while that toddler was brought along for the burglary. Officers believed Andrew appeared to be under the influence. They also noticed that 2-year-old Maddox was not dressed appropriately for the Maine winter. That incident changed the custody situation almost immediately. About 2 weeks after Andrew's arrest, the case returned to court. A judge decided that Maddox would live with Jessica while Andrew entered a drug treatment program. It is important to be precise here. The documented decision was made after Andrew was arrested and concerns were raised about his impairment and Maddox's safety in his care. That does not mean the court knowingly placed Maddox into a home where he would be abused, but it did mean that the home where he had spent most of his life was no longer considered a safe option at that moment. And once again, Maddox was the one absorbing the consequences of an adult's choices. For the following months, he lived with Jessica and Jason while Andrew worked through treatment. According to the records described in the case, Andrew did what the program required. His providers reported that he participated and made progress. He passed the drug screenings he was given. He also tried to see Maddox. Jessica, however, reportedly obstructed those visits. Andrew eventually hired an attorney and returned to court to enforce his right to have contact with his son. By October 2020, the court established shared custody. Maddox would alternate between his parents, spending 1 week with Andrew and the next with Jessica. For a short time, it seemed to work. Then, in December, Jessica again began keeping Maddox from his father. She stopped following the alternating week arrangement, and concerns were also being raised about possible drug use inside her home. Andrew went back to court in February 2021, asking that Jessica be held in contempt for violating the custody order. What emerged from those proceedings should have raised serious questions. Jessica tested positive for THC and methadone. Methadone may be legally prescribed as part of treatment for opioid addiction, so the result by itself did not establish illegal drug use. But she would not sign releases that could have allowed the relevant information to be reviewed. She also refused to let a child welfare worker question the children privately without her present. There were other concerns. Jessica had not been taking the children to their regular medical checkups, and her older children had accumulated a troubling number of school absences. On Andrew's side, the picture looked different. His screenings were clean, and his treatment providers said he was engaged and doing well. Still, after considering the information available at that time, officials found insufficient grounds to remove the children from Jessica and Jason's home. The shared custody arrangement resumed, and Jessica was urged to comply with it. For about another month, Maddox moved between his parents every other week, and then Andrew made another decision that put everything at risk. On March 7th, 2021, police received a call from a local business reporting that Andrew appeared highly intoxicated. Officers reviewed surveillance footage and agreed that he seemed impaired and should not be driving. They went to his home and found him still sitting inside a parked car. Maddox and another young child were in the back seat. When officers asked Andrew to get out, he stumbled. He struggled even to operate his phone and could not work out whom he should call to take responsibility for the children. According to the account of the incident, he had no safe plan for them and did not appear to understand the danger of the situation. Andrew told police that he had taken prescribed Suboxone and Xanax, but whether the medication was prescribed was not the immediate issue. Officers believed he was impaired. He had been behind the wheel with young children in the car, and they considered him unsafe to drive. Andrew was arrested for operating under the influence. Child welfare workers took custody of both children. This is the contradiction at the center of Andrew's role in Maddox's story. He fought for visitation. He completed treatment requirements. He passed screenings and went to court when Jessica kept his son from him. Those are not the actions of someone who simply did not care. But care did not prevent him from taking Maddox into a burglary. It did not prevent him from allegedly using the child's stroller to hold stolen property. And it did not prevent him from sitting behind the wheel while visibly impaired with Maddox in the back seat. Love was there. Safety was not. After Andrew's arrest, Maddox was placed temporarily with a paternal aunt. She took him home, and when caseworkers checked on him, they saw a little boy who appeared happy and content, playing with his cousins. He was with relatives. He was comfortable. For that one day, he was safe. But the placement lasted only one day. When child welfare officials contacted Jessica, she refused to participate in the initial safety assessment and said she would not allow a caseworker into her home. She insisted that the department had already assessed her and found no concerns. Then she announced that she was going to collect Maddox anyway. On March 8th, she did. And the final 104 days of Maddox Williams' life began. The central question is not whether there were warning signs. It is how each warning sign was documented, explained away, or left unresolved. On March 8th, 2021, Jessica collected 3-year-old Maddox from his paternal aunt. He had spent the previous day at the aunt's home after Andrew was arrested for driving under the influence with children in his car. A caseworker had seen Maddox there. He appeared happy and content, playing with his cousins. Jessica had initially refused to participate in a new safety assessment. She insisted that her home had already been evaluated and that no concerns had been found. She was taking her son back regardless. 3 days later, child welfare workers were allowed into Jessica's home. They saw Maddox and the other children. They interviewed Jessica and Jessica Trefethen. But there was an important limit. Jessica would not permit the workers to question the children or observe them without her present. Think about what that meant. The children could be seen, but they could not be heard privately. Even with that restriction, workers did not identify an immediate reason to remove them. Instead, they opened a case intended to provide the family with support and continued monitoring while Andrew's legal situation moved through the courts. Andrew posted bail on the DUI charge and had some contact with Maddox. It didn't last. within days, or roughly a week, according to the account later given. Andrew was arrested again, this time over allegations involving illegal hunting and possession of a firearm by a prohibited person. He remained in jail awaiting trial. And with Andrew incarcerated, the shared custody arrangement effectively disappeared. Maddox was now living with Jessica full-time. That is where the final 104 days of his life began. 1 month later, on April 8th, the danger inside the home became impossible to describe as merely a custody dispute. At 1:25 that afternoon, Jessica called police and reported domestic violence. She said Jason had pushed her hard, threatened to kill her, and was using heroin. When officers arrived, they documented red marks on Jessica. They described the home as unkempt and messy. More troubling was the condition of the children. They appeared upset, and the oldest child was crying while holding the younger siblings, apparently trying to keep them safe. That image gets me. A child trying to become the protector because the adults around her were not providing protection. Jason was arrested for domestic violence. The following day, caseworkers returned to speak with Jessica. Once again, she would not allow them to interview the children privately. So there had been a report involving drugs, an alleged death threat, visible marks, distressed children, a disorderly home, and an arrest. Yet the children themselves still could not speak to caseworkers outside Jessica's presence. The concern was documented. The case remained open. But Maddox remained in the home. His paternal grandmother, Victoria Vos, kept trying to reach him. She called whenever she could and repeatedly asked to visit. Jessica always seemed to have an explanation. She was too busy. Maddox was not feeling well. It wasn't a good time. And reduced contact mattered because Victoria and Andrew had already noticed injuries after Maddox returned from periods in Jessica's care. When shared custody began in late 2020, they sometimes saw bruises on his face and body. According to their later accounts, they photographed what they found and took him for medical evaluation. Part of the reason was to create a record, to show what Maddox looked like when he came back and to make sure they were not blamed for injuries they said had appeared elsewhere. Those records would become important at trial. So would Jessica's own messages. In December 2020, while Andrew was struggling to see Maddox, Jessica sent messages describing the boy as clumsy. She also wrote about keeping him away from his paternal family so they would not think something was wrong. Then, in April 2021, she told a friend that Maddox had bruised his forehead after falling from her vehicle because the children treated it like a jungle gym. She had been expected to take him to a birthday party that day, but did not bring him because of the bruising. In another message, Jessica said Maddox had fallen from a tire swing and somehow ended up with 2 black eyes. She added that she had been trying to keep him hidden. Now, we need to be precise here. Those messages existed. What they meant was disputed. Jessica presented Maddox as a child who fell frequently and suffered one accident after another. Prosecutors later argued that the messages served another purpose, creating explanations for injuries and keeping Maddox out of sight while those injuries were visible. And it wasn't just the messages. Some of Maddox's bruises were later found beneath temporary tattoos. Prosecutors pointed to that detail as evidence that visible marks had been concealed. A temporary tattoo on a 3-year-old is ordinary. A temporary tattoo positioned over a bruise is something else entirely, especially when it appears alongside messages about hiding him. The picture that emerged at trial became even more disturbing when members of Jessica's own family testified. Jessica's oldest child said her mother treated Maddox's bruises differently from injuries suffered by the other children. She testified that she had seen Jessica slap Maddox across the mouth multiple times. She also described an incident during a family trip to New Hampshire around Easter. According to the child, Jessica threw Maddox out of a hotel bathroom and onto the hard floor, leaving him with skinned knees and elbows, a scratch on his face, and another bruise on his forehead. Sherry Johnson, Jessica's mother, later testified that she had also witnessed Jessica slap Maddox in the mouth. Hard enough, she believed, that it could have knocked out a tooth. By late May, Sherry noticed that one of Maddox's teeth was missing. Jessica reportedly told her that he had fallen and struck his face on a table. A few weeks later, Sherry saw that another tooth was gone. This time, the explanation was simply that Maddox had fallen again. Sherry's testimony went further. She said Jessica and Jason regularly called Maddox cruel names and punished him more severely than the other children. At times, according to Sherry, Jessica made him face a wall or lie face down because she did not want to look at him. Sherry testified that Jessica referred to Maddox's Ugly face and claimed Jessica treated him differently because he looked too much like Andrew. Those were Sherry's claims under oath, not assumptions about Jessica's private thoughts. but they gave the jury a possible context for something visible throughout the timeline. Maddox was being isolated within his own home. Still, no one outside that home had the entire picture at the time. Victoria had photographs and memories of bruises. Andrew had concerns but was back in jail after repeatedly endangering his children himself. Caseworkers had an open file, but no private interviews with the children. Police had documented domestic violence, drug allegations, and frightened children. Friends had received Jessica's explanations about falls, black eyes, and why Maddox was being kept out of sight. Each warning sign existed in its own compartment. No single intervention brought all of them together, or removed Maddox from the home. By late spring, Jessica told Victoria that the family was going to New Hampshire for a camping trip. She said they would be away for 2 weeks. Once they returned, she promised Victoria could finally see her grandson. But by June 2021, Maddox had bruises, missing teeth, reduced contact with his paternal family, and a record of explanations describing one accident after another. Victoria was promised another visit after the trip. Instead, the next time the family heard about Maddox, he was pale, gray, and being carried into an emergency department. At around 1:00 p.m. on June 20th, 2021, Jessica and her mother brought Maddox to Waldo County General Hospital in Belfast. Medical staff immediately saw that the timeline they were being given did not match the child in front of them. Jessica said Maddox had been playing outside with the other children when he became tangled in the leash of the family's puppy. According to her account, the dog knocked him down and dragged him, possibly causing him to strike a boulder. Then, she said, Maddox's 8-year-old sister kicked him hard in the abdomen. That detail needs to be handled carefully. Maddox's sister was a child herself. She was not responsible for his death, and the medical evidence would contradict the attempt to explain his fatal injuries through the actions of an 8-year-old. But at the hospital, before doctors had even determined the full extent of what happened, Jessica's story placed that child directly inside the explanation. And the story didn't end with the kick. Jessica claimed Maddox had gotten back up and walked home. He complained that his stomach hurt and said he was extremely thirsty, but he was still conscious and moving around. She gave him cereal and something to drink. Then, according to her, he appeared well enough that she sent him outside to play again. A few minutes later, Maddox returned and curled up beside her on the couch. "My tummy hurts," he reportedly said. "My tummy hurts so much." Jessica said that was the moment she understood something was seriously wrong. She called her mother, Sherry Johnson, and asked her to come over so they could take Maddox to the hospital. But Sherry's later testimony added another layer to that call. She said she had been speaking with a friend when Jessica began repeatedly trying to reach her. Sherry declined the first call, but Jessica kept calling until she finally answered. And at least initially, Jessica did not describe a catastrophic injury. She said Maddox had a bit of a stomachache and that she needed some help. A stomachache. By the time Sherry arrived, however, Maddox did not look like a child with a minor complaint. She said he was already pale and gray. Whatever had happened, this was no longer a situation where someone could reasonably wait and see if he felt better. They placed Maddox in the car and started toward the hospital. During that final drive, according to Sherry, Jessica told Maddox that she loved him. Maddox, barely clinging to consciousness, answered that he loved her too. That's the part that is almost impossible to sit with. After everything the evidence would later reveal about Maddox's final weeks, he was still a 3-year-old speaking to his mother. He still answered with love. Then he lost consciousness. Jessica later told investigators that Maddox had still been responsive when they left the house. She said it was only when they reached the hospital parking lot that she realized he had stopped breathing. She rushed him inside, but to the doctors and nurses who received him, his condition suggested he had been critically ill for much longer than the car ride. Maddox was cold to the touch. He was unresponsive, pulseless, and not breathing. His pupils were dilated and did not react to light. His neck was limp, while his arms and legs were extremely stiff. His abdomen was distended and tense, an immediate sign of serious internal trauma. And then there were the injuries visible on the outside. Maddox had bruises across his body, not all of them new. Some appeared to be in different stages of healing, indicating they had been inflicted or sustained at different times. There was a prominent bruise and swelling on his forehead. Placed over that injury was a temporary tattoo. Medical staff also saw other bruising that appeared to have been covered in the same way. Think about what the team had been told. A small puppy. A leash. A fall. A possible impact with a rock. A kick from another child. Then compare that with what they were seeing. a 3-year-old in full cardiac arrest, with widespread injuries and clinical signs suggesting that his body had been failing for some time. The staff began resuscitation immediately. For more than an hour, they tried to bring Maddox back. These were doctors and nurses working on a child who had arrived without a pulse, doing everything available to restart his heart and keep oxygen moving through his body. But Maddox had reached the hospital too late. 3-year-old Maddox Williams was pronounced dead. The people who had worked to save him were exhausted and devastated. But approximately 10 minutes after her son was pronounced dead, Jessica left the hospital. Leaving by itself did not prove what had happened inside the home. People respond to sudden death in different ways, and grief does not follow one acceptable script. But in this case, the timing mattered. Jessica left before investigators could fully question her about an account that medical staff already found difficult to reconcile with Maddox's condition. Her departure would later become significant to both police and the jury. And even before Maddox was officially pronounced dead, police had received information that pushed the case beyond a medical emergency. An informant contacted law enforcement after reportedly receiving a message from Jessica Trefethen. According to the informant, Jason said Jessica had been abusing Maddox and that the boy was now at the hospital. That allegation arrived while Jessica was still there. Police called her phone, but Sherry answered. Officers told Sherry not to let Jessica leave because they needed to speak with her. Sherry relayed the request. Jessica said she was not ready to talk to anyone. Then she left anyway. She and Sherry drove out of the hospital parking lot before officers could sit down with her and go through the story. Police immediately began trying to locate her. Their first stop was the home where Maddox had spent his final hours. Jessica was not there. Sherry was, and she told officers she had dropped her daughter at a pier in Searsport. She claimed she did not know where Jessica had gone after that. Meanwhile, Maddox's surviving siblings were placed in Sherry's care under a court-ordered safety plan, and Jessica was prohibited from contacting them. In the space of a few hours, the story had changed completely. Maddox had arrived at the hospital under an explanation involving children playing outside and a family puppy. But doctors saw evidence of severe trauma, older bruises, and a child who appeared to have been critically ill well before reaching the parking lot. Then came the message alleging abuse. Then Jessica left. The medical team could not save Maddox, and the condition of his body made an ordinary playground accident appear implausible. His death became a homicide investigation almost immediately. But before police could test Jessica's story, they first had to find her. And she had already started changing phones, changing locations, and asking friends for somewhere to hide. Jessica later said she avoided police because she was grieving. Her own messages described the situation differently. Police were trying to charge her, and she needed a place to hide. That distinction matters, because investigators were not simply trying to reach a mother who had left the hospital in shock. They were trying to find someone who appeared to be taking deliberate steps to make herself difficult to locate. After Jessica sped out of the hospital parking lot, officers went to her home. Jessica was not there. Her mother, Sherry, was. Sherry told them she had dropped Jessica off at a pier in Searsport and had no idea where her daughter went after that. If true, Jessica could have been almost anywhere. Police now had to work outward, contacting relatives, speaking with friends, checking possible locations, and asking whether anyone had heard from her. At the same time, there were other children to protect. Under a court-ordered safety plan, Jessica's remaining children were placed in Sherry's home. Jessica was prohibited from having contact with them. So think about the situation investigators were dealing with. Maddox had just died with injuries that hospital staff found deeply concerning. His mother had left before police could question her. Her location was unknown. And the other children were now staying with the same person who claimed she had driven Jessica to a pier and then lost track of her. Detectives also interviewed Jessica Trefethen. Jason said he had not been home when Maddox received the fatal injuries, so he had not witnessed whatever happened. He claimed he did not know how Maddox had been hurt. He also said he had not seen anything in the preceding weeks that caused him concern. And as for Jessica? Jason said he had not heard from her and did not know where she was. For the first few days, the search went nowhere. Investigators contacted family members and friends. They followed possible leads. But each path seemed to end the same way, with no Jessica and no reliable explanation of where she had gone. Then, on the morning of June 23rd, police returned to Sherry. Once again, she initially claimed that she had not heard from Jessica since June 20th, the day Maddox died. According to Sherry, the story had not changed. She had dropped her daughter off, and she did not know what happened after that. This time, however, investigators had something they did not have during the first conversation. They had obtained a warrant for footage from Sherry's home security system. The video showed that Jessica had returned to the house on the night of June 20th. It also showed her there again on June 21st. So Sherry's story about the pier was no longer just questionable. It had been contradicted by the security footage. Jessica had not vanished into Searsport without contacting her mother. She had returned to the very home where her other children had been placed for protection. That created a second problem. Both women knew Jessica was barred from contacting those children under the safety plan. Yet the footage showed Jessica at the house anyway. And the more investigators reconstructed those 3 days, the less Jessica's behavior looked like someone who simply needed a little time alone. She reportedly communicated with friends, relatives, and Jason through phone numbers that were not her own. She and Jason also used alternate email accounts to exchange messages. Jessica avoided using her regular phone. She did not use her debit or credit cards, anything that could leave an easy trail for police to follow. Friends reportedly picked her up and dropped her off at different locations, allowing her to move without using her own vehicle or accounts. Then there were the messages themselves. In one, Jessica told a friend that police were trying to charge both her and Jason. She said she needed somewhere to hide out because authorities were saying she had killed Maddox. In another message, she wrote that her son had died and that police and DHHS were at her house. Then she made her intention clear. She was not going home to deal with it. She asked the friend to keep the conversation private. When that friend asked what had happened to Maddox, Jessica's answer was simply, IDK. Those are not the words of someone merely sitting alone with grief. They show that Jessica understood police were looking for her, believed she might be charged, and was actively seeking help to remain out of sight. Eventually, Jessica returned to Sherry's house. By then, investigators knew Sherry had lied about her daughter's whereabouts. They also knew Jessica had been allowed into the home despite the no-contact order involving the children. Faced with the footage and the possibility of consequences for helping conceal Jessica, Sherry finally gave police her daughter's location. On June 23rd, 3 days after Maddox died, Jessica was detained. Her interview lasted approximately 2 hours. And now that investigators finally had her in front of them, Jessica began offering explanations. Not only for what she said happened on June 20th, but for injuries Maddox had apparently suffered before that day. She described Maddox as clumsy. He fell frequently, she said. About a week before his death, he had supposedly fallen from a trampoline. Then Jessica raised another issue, Maddox's missing teeth. She claimed that during the weeks before his death, Maddox had spent time with his father and sometimes returned with teeth missing. That would obviously have been concerning. Maddox was only 3. These were not teeth he should have been naturally losing at that age. But there was a serious problem with Jessica's attempt to point toward Andrew. During the relevant recent period, Andrew was incarcerated. He had not been having the kind of visits that could explain a newly missing tooth or any other recent injury. Jessica was suggesting injuries might have happened during time alone with his father when that time alone had not occurred. Her account also conflicted with what Sherry later said Jessica had told her. According to Sherry, she had noticed one of Maddox's missing teeth weeks before his death and asked Jessica what happened. At that point, Jessica had not blamed Andrew. She said Maddox had fallen and struck his face on a table. So which explanation was investigators supposed to believe? That Maddox returned from his father's care with missing teeth? Or that he lost one by hitting a table while he was with Jessica? Jessica denied ever striking any of her children. She told investigators, "My kids are my world." And when detectives asked about June 20th, she returned to essentially the same account given at the hospital. The children had been playing outside without adult supervision. Maddox became tangled in the leash of a roughly 15-pound puppy and was knocked down or dragged. His 8-year-old sister then kicked him in the stomach. Maddox came inside complaining that he was thirsty and that his stomach hurt. Jessica said she gave him cereal and something to drink, then allowed him to go back outside. A short time later, he returned, curled up with her on the couch, and repeatedly said that his stomach hurt. Only then, according to Jessica, did she realize how serious his condition was and call Sherry to help take him to the hospital. She also admitted she had hidden from police for 3 days, but she insisted that this was not because she had hurt Maddox. She said she was grieving and could not bear to speak with anyone, especially investigators. Again, that explanation had to be weighed against the practical steps she had taken and the messages she had sent. Borrowed numbers, alternate accounts, no bank cards, friends moving her between locations, a direct request for somewhere to hide. Police now had Jessica's account. but they also had a house to search. Inside Jessica and Jason's home, investigators recovered several items that appeared to contain blood: multiple bath towels, a washcloth, a chair cushion, and a leather reclining chair. The items were sent to the crime laboratory for testing. The results linked blood on multiple items to Maddox's DNA. That finding established something Jessica's story did not explain. Maddox had not merely become sick after an outdoor accident. He had bled in several places inside the home. By the end of those 3 days, police had found Jessica, exposed important parts of the effort to conceal her location, and recovered physical evidence connecting Maddox's injuries to the house. But the blood could only show where part of the violence had played out. It could not, by itself, explain the force used against him. The autopsy did more than reject the story about a leash and a kick. It revealed force comparable to a severe crash, a great fall, or an adult stomping on a small child. One injury might be explained as a fall. Maddox's body showed a pattern: older wounds, recent wounds, and damage that no ordinary childhood accident could account for. The autopsy documented contusions across his head and body. There was a laceration to one ear, injuries inside his mouth, and 3 missing teeth. One tooth socket was fractured. Examiners also found bleeding around the brain, fractures to 2 spinal vertebrae, and catastrophic trauma inside his abdomen. His pancreas had been transected. His bowel had ruptured. There were hemorrhages and lacerations involving multiple internal organs. And the timing mattered. According to the medical examiner, the fatal abdominal injuries were recent. They had likely been inflicted within hours of Maddox's death. This was not simply a collection of marks accumulated by an active 3-year-old. The internal damage required tremendous force, the kind associated with a severe car crash, a fall from a significant height, or an adult kicking or stomping on a child. The overall pattern did not fit a fall from a trampoline. It did not fit the story of a 15-pound puppy tangling Maddox in its leash and dragging him. And it could not be explained by a kick from another child. That distinction is important. Jessica's 8-year-old daughter was a child herself. The medical findings did not support placing responsibility for Maddox's death on her. The bruises told a longer story. Some were fresh. Others were already healing. That meant they had been inflicted on separate occasions over a period of days and weeks, not all during one final incident outside the house. Temporary tattoos had been placed over some of those bruises, but they were still visible during the examination. The medical examiner concluded that Maddox died from non-accidental blunt force trauma. His injuries were consistent with battered child syndrome. In plain terms, Maddox had not suffered one terrible accident. He had been hurt repeatedly. And then he was fatally injured. The condition of his teeth added another problem for Jessica's account. One tooth had apparently been lost within roughly a day of his death. The others had been missing longer. During her police interview, Jessica suggested Maddox sometimes returned from time with Andrew missing teeth. But Andrew had been incarcerated during the weeks before Maddox died. He could not have been alone with him during the period in which the newest injuries occurred. And Jessica had offered a different explanation before. When Sherry noticed one missing tooth weeks earlier and asked what happened, Jessica reportedly said Maddox had fallen and struck his face on a table. When another tooth disappeared, the explanation changed again. Maddox had simply fallen down. So which story was the truth? The medical evidence could not identify every individual moment of abuse. It could not tell investigators the exact date of every bruise. But it could establish that these injuries happened at different times, and that the fatal trauma occurred while Maddox was in Jessica's care. On June 24th, 2021, 4 days after Maddox died, Jessica was arrested and charged with depraved indifference murder. She pleaded not guilty and remained in custody while the case moved toward trial. That trial began in October 2022, and prosecutors did not present Maddox's death as an isolated explosion of violence. They reconstructed what they argued was an escalating pattern, one visible in custody exchanges, photographs, medical visits, text messages, and the memories of people who had watched Maddox's treatment change. Andrew and Victoria testified that after shared custody began, they sometimes noticed bruises on Maddox's face and body when he returned from Jessica's home. They took him to be examined. They photographed the marks. Part of their concern was that the injuries might be blamed on them, but they also wanted a record in case the pattern continued and someone needed to intervene. That is one of the most painful details in this case. Maddox's bruises were not invisible. People saw them. They took pictures. They sought examinations. Yet every mark could still be separated from the next and explained as another fall, another accident, Another example of a supposedly clumsy child. At trial, Jessica's oldest child gave the jury a view from inside the home. She testified that her mother treated Maddox's injuries differently from those of the other children. She said she had seen Jessica slap him in the mouth multiple times. She also described an incident during the family's trip to New Hampshire around Easter 2021. According to the child, they were staying in a hotel when Jessica threw Maddox out of a bathroom and onto the hard floor. He was left with skinned knees and elbows, a scratch on his face, and a bruise on his forehead. Then Sherry took the stand. When investigators first spoke with her, she had acted as though she knew nothing about Maddox being abused. She said she had noticed injuries, asked Jessica about them, and accepted the explanations she was given. Her trial testimony went much further. Sherry admitted that she had personally witnessed Jessica slap Maddox hard in the mouth on more than one occasion. Hard enough, she believed, that it could have knocked out a tooth. She had also seen the missing teeth. Yet when Jessica said one was lost after Maddox struck a table and another after he fell, Sherry did not intervene. She described Maddox being treated more harshly than the other children. According to her testimony, Jessica and Jason called him insulting names and subjected him to more severe punishment. Sometimes Maddox was ordered to face a wall. Other times, he was made to lie face down so Jessica would not have to look at him. Sherry testified that Jessica said she did not want to see Maddox's ugly face. She also claimed Jessica treated him badly because he resembled Andrew. Those statements were testimony presented at trial, not an independently proven psychological diagnosis or a complete explanation for Jessica's behavior. But they gave jurors context for what multiple witnesses described: Maddox being singled out inside the home where he was supposed to be protected. And then there was what Sherry did after he died. She helped Jessica avoid police. She allowed her back into the house despite a safety plan barring Jessica from contact with the remaining children. She lied about dropping Jessica near a pier and claimed not to know where she was. At trial, Sherry said she wished she had not helped her. She acknowledged that, deep down, she suspected Jessica would eventually be arrested. Sherry faced a separate charge of hindering apprehension. She was convicted and received a 3.5-year suspended sentence, along with probation and community service requirements. The suspended sentence meant she did not serve those years in prison unless she violated the terms imposed by the court. By the end of the prosecution's presentation, the bruises were no longer disconnected marks. The missing teeth were no longer unrelated falls. The changing explanations were no longer harmless attempts to describe an unusually clumsy child. Together, the testimony, photographs, blood evidence from the house, and autopsy findings formed what prosecutors said was a documented pattern of escalating abuse. Most importantly, the medical evidence established that Maddox's death was not an accident. Jessica's defense now had to ask the jury to believe that all of it: the old bruises, the fresh internal injuries, the blood in the house, and the hiding, still began with a small puppy and a child's kick. The defense did not deny that Maddox was terribly injured. It argued that no one had proved Jessica was the person who inflicted those injuries. That was the line the jury had to examine during a 6-day trial. Not whether Maddox had been hurt. He clearly had. Not whether his injuries were severe. The medical evidence made that impossible to dispute. The real question was narrower, and much more important: who had done it? The prosecution built its case as a chain. No single piece of evidence was supposed to carry the entire weight. Instead, the state asked the jury to look at the patterns surrounding Maddox in the months before his death. Jessica controlled the home where he was living. Witnesses described Maddox being treated differently from the other children. His injuries were noticed again and again. And according to testimony, the explanations changed depending on who was asking. One witness was Jessica's oldest child, who was 9 years old when she testified. She said her mother treated Maddox's bruises differently from the injuries of the other children. She also testified that she had seen Jessica slap Maddox in the mouth multiple times. That testimony mattered because the missing teeth were not an isolated detail. Maddox had lost 3 teeth. One socket was fractured. His grandmother, Sherry Johnson, testified that she had seen Jessica slap Maddox hard enough that a tooth could have been knocked out. When Sherry noticed a missing tooth, Jessica reportedly said Maddox had hit his face on a table. Later, when another tooth was missing, the explanation was that he had simply fallen, and the bruises came with their own explanations. In messages to friends, Jessica described Maddox as clumsy. She said he had fallen from a vehicle. She said he had fallen from a tire swing and somehow developed 2 black eyes. She wrote that she was trying to keep him hidden because of the injuries. The prosecution argued that these messages were not random updates. They were explanations being created before anyone had directly challenged her. A paper trail, in the state's view, for injuries that were already visible. Temporary tattoos also became part of the evidence. Investigators and witnesses saw bruises in different places and at different stages of healing. Some of those bruises had been covered with temporary tattoos. The issue was not just that Maddox had been hurt once. It was the chronology. Older injuries, newer injuries, damage appearing over time. And then there was the home itself. After Jessica was arrested, police searched the residence. They found what appeared to be blood on a chair cushion, bath towels, a leather reclining chair, and a washcloth. Those items were sent to the crime lab. The blood came back as matching Maddox's DNA. That did not, by itself, show exactly what happened in the house. But the prosecution used it alongside the witness accounts and the medical findings. Maddox had suffered serious injuries. He had bled inside the home. His mother was the adult responsible for him there. And when he was taken to the hospital, the story she gave did not match the damage doctors found. This is where the legal charge came into focus. Depraved indifference murder does not require the state to prove that a person calmly planned a killing in advance. In plain language, it applies when someone's conduct shows such an extreme disregard for human life that the law treats the resulting death as murder. The prosecution's argument was that Maddox's death was not the result of one terrible accident. It was the result of violence inflicted on a child who depended entirely on his caregiver. But the defense offered a different explanation. Jessica said she had not witnessed the outdoor incident. She said the children had been outside with the puppy. According to her account, Maddox became tangled in the leash, was knocked down, and was dragged. She said she was later told that his 8-year-old sister had kicked him in the stomach. The defense argued that Maddox could have struck a boulder during the incident. That, it suggested, could explain the extensive bruising. And the defense returned to the same central point. No one had directly watched Jessica inflict the fatal injuries. That argument also required the jury to consider the 8-year-old carefully. The medical evidence did not support treating her as responsible for Maddox's death. The medical examiner concluded that the abdominal damage was far beyond what a child's kick could have caused. The fatal injuries reflected force from an adult, not the act described by Jessica. That distinction matters. The child mentioned in Jessica's explanation was a child herself. She should not be turned into a convenient answer for injuries the medical evidence said she could not have caused. The medical examiner walked the jury through Maddox's injuries and their timing. The damage to his abdomen and internal organs was recent, occurring only hours before his death. The injuries were consistent with a violent event involving adult force. They were not consistent with the puppy and kick explanation. The prosecution showed photographs. It presented the injury chronology. It brought forward the blood evidence from the home. Witnesses described what they had seen, what Maddox looked like when he arrived from Jessica's care, and how Jessica responded to his injuries. The picture the state presented was not a single moment lost in the chaos of June 20th. It was a series of warning signs leading toward that day. By the end of the trial, the jury had heard about the bruises, the missing teeth, the slaps, the messages, the tattoos placed over injuries, the blood inside the house, and the medical conclusion that Maddox had died from non-accidental trauma. Then the jurors left to deliberate. They were gone for approximately 1 hour. Just 1 hour to decide whether the state's chain of evidence was strong enough to establish Jessica's legal responsibility for her son's death. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Jessica A. Williams, also identified in case coverage as Jessica Trefethen, was found guilty of depraved indifference murder. The jury had rejected the explanation involving the puppy, the boulder, and Maddox's sister. They had accepted the prosecution's conclusion that the injuries were inflicted by an adult and that the death was the result of extreme violence against a dependent child. The courtroom then moved from guilt to punishment. At sentencing, the prosecution described the unbearable reality of a young child being completely dependent on an adult caregiver, only to be viciously beaten by that caregiver. That sentence captures the legal and human center of the case. Maddox could not leave. He could not ask for help. He could not explain what was happening to him. The person responsible for caring for him was also the person the jury found responsible for his death. The judge described Jessica's conduct as a twisted form of punishment directed at Maddox. The judge found that she had acted with hostility toward her own 3-year-old son. And afterward, rather than focusing on Maddox, she had focused on protecting herself. Jessica was sentenced to 47 years in prison. For Maddox's family, the sentence did not feel like justice restoring anything. It was a number attached to a loss that could not be repaired. And when the case moved into the public spotlight, Victoria Vos put that loss into words.
Instead of my family getting ready to celebrate Christmas and Maddox's 5th birthday next month, we are here at the sentencing of his murderer.
Maddox's mother, Jessica Trefethen, sentenced to 47 years in prison for his death in June of last year. A jury unanimously finding Trefethen guilty of depraved indifference murder in October. Maddox's paternal grandmother, Victoria Vos, says Trefethen deserved life in prison.
We got a life sentence, life without Maddox, and I felt she should have gotten a life sentence.
In June of 2021, Trefethen brought an injured Maddox to Waldo County General Hospital. He died shortly after. Trefethen claims the boy was injured when he was caught in a dog leash, dragged and then kicked by his older sister. But the medical examiner says his injuries were consistent with battered child syndrome. Maddox's loved ones struggled in the courtroom as they relived his tragic death.
The bruises that were visible on his extremities showed different stages of healing, having been inflicted on different occasions within the days and weeks prior to his death.
Maddox's father, Andrew Williams, also faults the Department of Health and Human Services and Office of Child Family Services for placing him in the care of his mother.
They were warned several times by my whole family and myself that this was going to happen, and they wouldn't listen.
Had they acted in a reasonable manner, Maddox might still be alive.
Former State Senator Bill Diamond in attendance of the sentencing, saying Maine's child protection system continues to fail to protect children in state care.
We have to change the policies. The culture in the Department of Health and Human Services is broken. The system is broken.
Maddox's family hopes Tuesday's sentencing can lead to a road of healing, wanting Maddox to be remembered as a caring, funny, beautiful boy.
Just holding on to the good memories. I'm sure we have a lot of good memories.